The Fall of the Eldar, Birth of Slaanesh, and the Creation of the Eye of Terror. In the vast and unforgiving darkness of the galaxy, there exists no tragedy more profound, no catastrophe more complete than the fall of the Eldari. This is a tale of a civilization that once commanded the stars themselves, a species so advanced and powerful that they shaped reality according to their whims, who created wonders beyond mortal comprehension and wielded psychic might that could extinguish suns. Yet despite their godlike power, the Eldari brought upon themselves a doom so terrible that its echoes still reverberate through the galaxy 10,000 years later. This is the story of how hubris and excess birthed a god of depravity, how an empire spanning millions of worlds was consumed in a single psychic scream, and how the very fabric of reality was torn asunder to create the nightmare realm known as the Eye of Terror. The ancient Eldari would not speak of their past to lesser races, those they dismissively called Munke and other crude names. To them, the other species that crawled across the galaxy were children playing with fire, primitives who could never understand the heights from which the Eldari had fallen. But through fragments preserved in their mythic cycles, through the ritual dances of the Harlequins who keep their history alive, and through the terrible evidence written across the stars themselves, we can piece together the magnitude of what was lost and the horror of how it was lost. This is not merely the death of an empire. This is the story of a species that murdered itself through its own perfection, that created from its own souls an entity of such terrible power that it devoured their gods and shattered their civilization in a single moment of catastrophic birth. Before we can understand the fall, we must first comprehend what the Eldari were at their zenith, for only then can we grasp the true scale of their tragedy. Long before humanity had even begun to walk upright upon old Earth, when Terra's people were little more than primitive hunter-gatherers huddling in caves against the darkness, the Eldari Empire already spanned the breadth of the galaxy. They were the inheritors of a cosmos left empty by the war in heaven, that ancient and terrible conflict between the Old Ones and the Necrons that had scarred reality itself. The Old Ones, those mysterious and powerful beings who had shaped so many of the galaxy's intelligent races, had created the Eldari as weapons in that primordial war, crafting them with psychic potential beyond any other species. The Eldari were not merely intelligent or long-lived, though they were certainly both. Every member of their race was born a potent psyker, their minds naturally attuned to the currents of the immaterium that flowed beneath reality like an ocean beneath the surface of the world. This connection to what they would come to call the warp gave them abilities that seemed like magic to lesser species. They could manipulate matter with thought alone, craft substances that responded to psychic energy as living tissue responds to nurture and care. Their technology was so advanced that it seemed to defy the very laws of physics as understood by other races. They created the substance known as wraithbone, a psychoreactive crystalline material that formed the skeletons of their vessels and the bones of their constructs, growing under the guidance of specialists called bone singers who sang matter into shape. The extent of the Eldari Empire at its height defies easy comprehension. Millions of worlds across the galaxy bore their elegant touch, planets transformed into paradises through the application of technologies that could reshape entire ecosystems with the ease that a gardener tends to flowers. Their Craftworld vessels, which would later become the salvation of a desperate few, originally served as massive trading ships that plied the space lanes between distant stars, each one a mobile city housing hundreds of thousands of Eldari and carrying with them the fruits of countless worlds. The Eldari had mastered the webway, that ancient network of corridors through the Immaterium created by the Old Ones, allowing them to traverse the galaxy without subjecting themselves to the raw chaos of warp travel. Through these passages, they could move between worlds in the blink of an eye, connecting their far-flung empire with threads of controlled space-time. Their society had evolved beyond the need for manual labor or struggle. Sophisticated automata performed every task necessary to sustain their civilization, leaving the Eldari free to pursue higher callings. They were a race of artists, philosophers, scientists, and dreamers who had solved the practical problems of existence and could dedicate themselves entirely to the refinement of culture and the expansion of knowledge. Death itself held no terror for them, for when an Eldari died, their soul would dissolve peacefully back into the warp to rest among their gods before being reborn into new forms. The cycle of life and death was simply another aspect of existence, no more frightening than the change of seasons. The warp did not thirst for Eldari souls then as it would come to do, and the passage from life to death and back again was as natural as breathing. The Eldari pantheon of gods walked among them in those early days, or so the legends say. Asuryan, the Phoenix King, eldest and mightiest of the gods, whose fire represented wisdom and the psychic strength of the universe itself. Isha, the Great Mother, goddess of fertility and harvest, who wept tears of compassion for her mortal children. Kurnos, the Hunter, her consort, who embodied desire and gave the Eldari their drive to prosper. Vol, the Smith, the artificer god, whose forge produced wonders beyond mortal craft, including the legendary 100 swords of the war in heaven. Kain, the bloody-handed, the god of war and murder, whose rage was terrible but whose strength protected the Eldari from their enemies. Kagorak, the laughing god, the trickster and artist who found joy in every moment. Lilith, the maiden, goddess of dreams and prophecy, whose visions revealed futures yet unwritten. Morai-Heg the crone, keeper of fate and souls, who saw the threads of destiny that bound all living things. Each of these gods had given gifts to the Eldari at the moment of their creation, or so the myth cycles tell. Asuryan gave wisdom, that they might know themselves. Isha gave love, that they might know one another. Vol gave artifice, that they might make their dreams into reality. Lilith gave joy, that they might know happiness. Kurnos gave desire, that they might prosper and grow. Morai-Heg gave foresight, that they might know their place in the cosmos. And Kain gave anger, that they might have the means to defend all that had been given to them. These gifts defined the Eldari spirit, making them a people of profound emotion and boundless creativity, but also sowing the seeds of the tragedy that would eventually consume them. In those early times, there was no barrier between the realm of mortals and the realm of gods. The Eldari could walk in both worlds, and the gods moved freely among their people, teaching and guiding them through an age of peace and prosperity. But this golden age could not last forever. The mythology speaks of how Lilith dreamed a troubling dream, a vision of the future in which the Eldari would cause the destruction of Kain himself. The war god, taking this prophecy seriously, resolved to destroy the mortal race before they could fulfill this dark destiny. His rampage across the Eldari worlds was terrible, and only the intercession of Isha, weeping for her slaughtered children, caused Asuryan to intervene. The Phoenix King created a barrier between the Immaterium and the material realm, separating gods from mortals forevermore, and decreeing that never again would the deities walk among the Eldari. This separation was the first crack in the foundation of Eldari civilization, though none recognized it as such at the time. Isha, unable to bear being cut off from her beloved children, worked with Vol to create the Spirit Stones, crystallized tears that would allow communication between the separated realms. When Asuryan discovered this violation of his decree, he gave both Isha and Kurnos to Kain to do with as he pleased, and the war god imprisoned them in his own realm. This ancient drama, preserved in the mythic cycles performed by the Harlequins, foreshadowed the greater tragedy to come. The Eldari had already learned that their intense emotions and desires could bring them into conflict even with the gods themselves, and that their psychic nature meant their feelings had consequences that rippled through the warp itself. For millions of years, the Eldari Empire continued to flourish despite this ancient separation from their gods. They remained the dominant power in the galaxy, unchallenged by any other species. The Necrons, the only race that might have threatened them, slumbered in their tomb worlds, having retreated into hibernation after their war with the Citan had left them exhausted and broken. The other intelligent races of the galaxy were either too primitive to pose any threat, or too scattered to organize effective resistance against Eldari power. There were occasional conflicts, territorial disputes between Eldari factions, or small wars against uppity lesser species, but nothing that truly tested the Empire's strength. The Eldari grew comfortable in their supremacy, secure in the knowledge that no force in the material galaxy could stand against them. This very security, this absolute confidence in their own invincibility, planted the seeds of their downfall. With no external threats to unite them, with no struggles to occupy their boundless energy and intellect, the Eldari turned inward. They had achieved everything that a civilization could achieve in the material realm. Their technology was so advanced, it seemed to border on magic. Their control over the webway gave them mastery of space and time. Their psychic abilities allowed them to reshape reality according to their desires. Every physical need was met by their automated systems. Every comfort and luxury was readily available. They had built a paradise, and in that paradise, they began to stagnate. The Eldari psyche was fundamentally different from that of other species, a consequence of the tremendous psychic potential that flowed through every member of their race. Where a human might experience joy or sorrow, an Eldari felt ecstasy or anguish. Where a human might know pleasure or pain, an Eldari experienced sensations of such intensity that they bordered on the transcendent. This depth of feeling had once been channeled into art, into the creation of beauty and wonder that elevated their civilization to heights no other race could match. But with no greater purpose to guide them, with no challenges to overcome or enemies to face, this intensity of emotion began to seek new outlets. It began subtly, as such things always do. Small groups of Eldari began to form what they called pleasure cults, societies dedicated to the exploration of sensation and experience. These were not, at first, the dens of depravity they would eventually become. In the beginning, they were simply gatherings of like-minded individuals who sought to push the boundaries of experience, to discover new heights of sensation that their long lives and heightened senses made possible. They pursued esoteric knowledge, delving into forbidden lore and arcane practices that previous generations had wisely avoided. They explored the limits of physical pleasure, seeking ever more intense experiences that would satisfy their heightened sensitivity. They experimented with ways to amplify and extend the sensations that made them feel truly alive. The problem with such pursuits was that the Eldari, with their psychically enhanced perceptions, could never quite be satisfied. Each new experience, no matter how intense, eventually became familiar and lost its edge. Each sensation, no matter how exquisite, would dull with repetition. And so the members of the pleasure cults found themselves on an endless treadmill, constantly seeking the next experience that would recreate that first transcendent moment, that initial rush of something genuinely new. This psychological trap, common to addicts of all species, was far more dangerous for the Eldari because of their psychic nature. When they pursued sensation with the full intensity of their being, the echoes of those pursuits rippled out into the warp itself, creating currents and eddies in the immaterium that would have consequences far beyond what any of them imagined. As the millennia passed, the pleasure cults proliferated across the Eldari Empire. What had begun as small gatherings of fringe elements within their society gradually spread until they touched every level of Eldari civilization. The old religions, the worship of the ancient gods who had once walked among them, began to decline as more and more Eldari turned away from tradition in favor of personal fulfillment. The pantheon of gods was still revered in theory, their stories still told and their names still invoked, but fewer and fewer Eldari actually called upon them for guidance or sought to live according to their teachings. Instead, the pleasure cults offered a different path, one that promised immediate gratification and ever-escalating experiences rather than patient adherence to ancient wisdom. The pursuit of sensation that had begun innocently enough took progressively darker turns as the cults sought to recapture the intensity of earlier experiences. Torture became an art form, studied and refined with the same dedication that previous generations had brought to sculpture or music. Murder was elevated to performance, with victims selected and killed according to elaborate aesthetic principles. The screams of the dying were appreciated as a form of music, their suffering savored as if it were fine wine. Those who had once created beauty now found equal satisfaction in creating horror. Those who had once sought to elevate the spirit now descended into obsessions that degraded and destroyed. The spiral had no bottom, for every boundary that was crossed simply revealed new boundaries waiting to be violated. Not all Eldari participated in this descent into madness, and those who resisted watched with growing horror as their civilization tore itself apart. The wise among the seers and farseers, those whose psychic gifts allowed them to perceive the currents of fate and possibility, began to have troubling visions. They saw the shadows of something terrible taking shape in the warp, a darkness that grew stronger with each passing year, fed by the corruption of Eldari civilization. They tried to warn their people, speaking of doom and disaster, preaching temperance and a return to the old ways. But their warnings fell on deaf ears. To the pleasure-addled masses, the seers seemed like dour fanatics obsessed with misery and self-denial, unable to embrace the new freedoms that their perfected civilization had earned them. Some Eldari, convinced that the path their civilization was following could only lead to destruction, chose to leave. These dissenters, who would come to be known as Exodites, abandoned the core worlds of the Empire and struck out for the distant fringes of the galaxy. They settled on wild planets at the very edges of Eldari space, worlds that had been marked as maiden worlds, kept pristine and uninhabited as reserves for future colonization. On these distant planets, the Exodites deliberately rejected the advanced technology and automated luxury that had left their kindred so vulnerable to corruption. They embraced a harder life, returning to manual labor and agricultural pursuits, living in harmony with the natural world rather than seeking to dominate it through technology. This was their hedge against the darkness they saw consuming the Empire, a conscious choice to step away from the precipice before the inevitable fall. The mainstream of Eldari society viewed the Exodites with contempt and pity. To those still caught up in the glittering decadence of the Empire, the Exodites seemed like backwards primitives, rejecting everything that made Eldari civilization great in favor of a rustic existence little better than that of animals. The departing Exodites were mocked as cowards and fools, too weak to embrace the new freedoms that the Empire offered. But the Exodites pressed on regardless, loading their families and what possessions they valued onto vessels and departing for their distant havens. They carried with them seeds and animals from the homeworlds, tools and knowledge for building new lives, and most importantly, they carried the determination to preserve something of the Eldari spirit before it was completely consumed by the darkness spreading through the Empire's heart. As the Eldari homeworlds descended deeper into depravity, another group began to recognize the magnitude of the danger they faced. The crews of the massive Craftworld trading vessels, those mobile cities that plied the trade routes between distant stars, had a unique perspective on what was happening to their civilization. Because these vessels spent centuries at a time away from the core worlds, traveling to the furthest reaches of Eldari space and back again, their crews could see the changes in their society with shocking clarity. Each time they returned home, the decay had progressed further, the corruption had spread more deeply. What might have seemed like gradual change to those who lived through it day by day was starkly obvious to those who saw it only at intervals of decades or centuries. The Craftworld crews made their choice as the final days approached. As their massive vessels made their scheduled returns to the Eldari homeworlds during what would be the last years before the fall, they found their worlds transformed into nightmare landscapes. Blood ran in the streets as the pleasure cults descended into outright murder and torture on a massive scale. The air was filled with screams, some of agony and some of ecstasy, often impossible to distinguish between the two. Order had completely broken down, with the higher governments of the Empire having long since ceased to function. The Eldari had created a hell of their own making, and the Craftworld crews knew with absolute certainty that anyone who remained would be consumed by it. The Craftworld crews began evacuating anyone they could save, anyone who had not yet been completely consumed by the madness of the pleasure cults. They loaded their massive vessels with Eldari from across the homeworlds, taking on board not just people, but also works of art, libraries of knowledge, preserved specimens of plant and animal life, anything they could salvage from the dying civilization. These refugees represented only a tiny fraction of the Eldari population, for by this point the vast majority had descended so far into corruption that they could not or would not be saved. The pleasure cults had spread like a disease through every level of society, and those who remained uncorrupted were scattered and few. With their holds full of refugees and relics, the Craftworlds turned away from the homeworlds for the last time and set course for distant space. They departed in the final weeks before the catastrophe, fleeing into the void even as the psychic pressure in the warp built to unbearable levels. Some Craftworlds would not make it far enough. The psychic shockwave would catch them before they could reach safety, tearing them apart along with the worlds they had left behind. Others would survive for thousands of years in isolation before their populations finally faded and died, unable to maintain their numbers across the long millennia of exile. But some, a precious few, would endure through all the ages to come, becoming the last bastions of uncorrupted Eldari civilization in a galaxy that had moved on without them. Those Eldari who did not flee, who remained on the homeworlds or in the Webway realms as the end approached, had sealed their fates. The pleasure cults had by this point evolved beyond anything that could be called civilization. Government had ceased to exist. Law had become meaningless. The only rule was the pursuit of sensation, pushed to extremes that defied description. The homeworlds had become charnel houses where torture, murder, and every conceivable perversion were practiced openly and celebrated as the highest forms of art. The Eldari who participated in these horrors believed themselves to be achieving new levels of consciousness, breaking through limitations to touch something transcendent. In a sense, they were right, though not in the way they imagined. What the pleasure-mad Eldari did not understand, what they could not perceive through the haze of their addictions, was that their actions were having consequences in the warp.
Every Eldari was a psychic being, their thoughts and emotions naturally projecting into the immaterium. When an individual Eldari felt something intensely, that emotion created ripples in the warp. When billions of Eldari all felt the same things at the same time, when they all pursued the same intense sensations and experiences, those ripples became waves. And when those waves all moved in the same direction, driven by the synchronized depravity of an entire civilization, they began to coalesce into something new.
In the warp, which does not operate according to the linear causality of the material universe, past and future blur together in ways that defy mortal understanding. The Gestalt consciousness that would become Slaanesh did not simply spring into being at the moment of its birth. It had been growing and taking shape for thousands of years, fed by the accumulated corruption of Eldari civilization. Yet it also existed backwards through time, its influence reaching into the past to encourage and amplify the very behaviors that would bring it into being. This temporal paradox is one of the reasons the fall was so difficult to prevent. The doom of the Eldari was written into history before it even began, a self-fulfilling prophecy encoded in the fundamental nature of their psychically sensitive souls. As the gestating God consciousness grew stronger in the warp, its influence began to make itself felt in the material universe. Across the galaxy, but especially concentrated in the regions where the Eldari held sway, terrible warp storms began to erupt. These were not natural phenomena, if anything about the warp can be called natural. They were manifestations of the tremendous psychic disturbance caused by the forming entity, reality itself buckling under the strain of what was being born. The warp storms made interstellar travel increasingly dangerous and eventually impossible across vast regions of space. Human civilizations that had expanded across the stars during their own age of technological achievements found themselves cut off from one another, their colonies isolated as the storms made warp travel too treacherous to attempt. This period, which humanity would come to call the Age of Strife, lasted for thousands of years and brought human civilization to the brink of extinction. Isolated colony worlds descended into barbarism. Technology was lost or destroyed. Knowledge that had taken millennia to accumulate was forgotten in the chaos. All of this was merely a side effect of what was happening to the Eldari, collateral damage from the birth of a god. The Eldari themselves, at the center of the storm, experienced the growing presence as a mounting psychic pressure, a weight that bore down on their minds and souls with increasing force. Those few who still retained some clarity of thought and purpose felt it as an approaching doom, an inevitable catastrophe that they were powerless to prevent. Then came the moments that would sunder an empire and reshape the galaxy forever. In the early years of the 30th millennium, by the reckoning of Terra's calendar, the entity that had been gestating in the warp for thousands of years finally achieved full consciousness and sentience. At that instant, Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, the youngest and in some ways the most terrible of the Chaos Gods, burst into existence with a scream that echoed across reality itself. This was not merely a psychic phenomenon. This was the universe itself being torn open. The barrier between the material realm and the immaterium being shattered by a birth of such catastrophic psychic force that it could not be contained within the warp alone. The psychic shockwave of Slaanesh's birth radiated outward from the heart of the Eldari Empire like a tsunami of pure emotion. Every Eldari within thousands of light years of the homeworlds died instantly, their souls ripped from their bodies and devoured by the newborn god in a single, terrible instant of consumption. The death toll was beyond comprehension. Trillions of Eldari, perhaps tens of trillions, died in the space of a heartbeat. Entire worlds full of Eldari were depopulated in seconds, their inhabitants simply collapsing where they stood as their souls were torn away. Cities that had stood for millions of years became silent tombs, filled with the bodies of the dead who had no time to cry out or understand what was happening to them. But the Eldari were not the only victims of that first terrible moment. The psychic shockwave extended far beyond the boundaries of the Eldari Empire, affecting every sentient being with even a fraction of psychic sensitivity. Billions of humans living on worlds near the Eldari territories died in the same instant, their souls caught up in Slaanesh's first feeding frenzy. Other species suffered similarly, psychers and normal beings alike falling dead as the shockwave passed over them. Even those who survived the initial blast found themselves affected by the psychic radiation, many driven insane by sensations and visions beyond their ability to process or understand. At the heart of the old Eldari Empire, where the homeworlds had stood for millions of years, something far worse than mere death occurred. The psychic pressure of Slaanesh's birth was so immense that it could not be contained within the warp. The barrier between the material universe and the immaterium, already weakened by millennia of Eldari excess, shattered completely. A massive rift tore open in the fabric of reality itself, creating a permanent wound where the two realms overlapped and merged into one horrific whole. This catastrophic breach in the structure of the universe would come to be known by many names across the galaxy, but to humanity it would forever be called the Eye of Terror. The Eye of Terror is not simply a region of space where the warp and reality coexist. It is a fundamental violation of the natural order, a place where the laws of physics no longer fully apply, and the madness of the immaterium bleeds directly into the material world. Approximately 20,000 light-years across at its widest extent, the Eye consumed hundreds of worlds that had once been Eldari homeworlds, transforming them into something neither fully real nor fully immaterial. These worlds, which the Eldari would later call the Crone worlds, became demon planets where the impossible was made manifest, and reality itself had become negotiable. Within the Eye of Terror, time has no meaning. A ship might enter and emerge years before it departed, or centuries afterward. Or it might experience subjective eons while only moments pass in the outside universe. Distance becomes fluid and changeable, with locations that should be light-years apart existing side by side, and places that appear close proving impossible to reach. The very matter of planets and stars within the Eye is suffused with warp energy, taking on properties that defy conventional understanding. Mountains might float in midair, oceans could flow uphill. The sky itself might bleed or weep or scream with voices drawn from the nightmares of a billion dead civilizations. The creation of the Eye of Terror was the single most catastrophic event in galactic history since the war in heaven itself, where once there had been the heart of the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known. Now there was only a festering wound in reality where demons walked openly, and the power of the chaos gods could reach directly into the material universe. The Eye became a haven for every heretic, traitor, and demon in existence. It became the staging ground from which the forces of chaos would launch their assaults on the galaxy for the next 10,000 years. And at its heart, sustained by the souls of trillions of dead Eldari, sat Slaanesh, the Dark Prince of Pleasure, the youngest but perhaps most insidious of the ruinous powers. The aftermath of Slaanesh's birth was immediate and terrible. Glutted on the psychic energy of countless Eldari souls, swollen with power from its catastrophic emergence into existence, the newborn Chaos God turned its attention to the beings who had existed in the warp before it, the ancient gods of the Eldari pantheon. These deities, who had once walked among their people in the early days of the race, had long ago retreated into the immaterium after Asuryani created the barrier between gods and mortals. They had existed there for millions of years, sustained by the belief and worship of their people, their essences woven into the fundamental psychic nature of the Eldari race. But the fall had devastated the Eldari people, killing the vast majority of those whose belief had sustained the pantheon. The ancient gods found themselves suddenly weakened, their power draining away as the psychic connection to their worshippers was severed by death. Slaanesh, by contrast, was at the absolute peak of its strength, bloated with the stolen souls of trillions and empowered by the very depravity that had brought it into being. The contest was never even close to fair. Slaanesh fell upon the Eldari pantheon with the hunger of a newborn predator, and one by one, the ancient gods fell before it. Asuryani, the Phoenix King, eldest and mightiest of the pantheon, fought against the upstart deity with all his considerable power. But even the lord of the Eldari gods could not stand against Slaanesh in its moments of triumph. The Prince of Pleasure consumed Asuryani, absorbing the god's essence and power into itself. Isha, the Great Mother, was defeated as well, though her fate was strange even by the standards of the warp. As Slaanesh moved to devour her as it had the others, the chaos god Nurgle intervened, driven by motivations that remain unclear. Some Eldari believe that Nurgle coveted Isha for himself, wanting to keep the goddess of life and fertility in his own domain of death and decay. Others suggest he sought to teach the youngest chaos god a lesson about respecting its elders. Whatever the reason, Nurgle's forces battled Slaanesh for possession of Isha, and somehow, impossibly, they won. According to the Eldari who still believe this tale, Isha now resides imprisoned in Nurgle's mansion within his plague gardens in the realm of chaos. The plague god tests his new diseases and pestilences upon her, and though her divine nature allows her to heal from any affliction, the process is agonizing beyond mortal comprehension. Yet even in her torment, Isha retains her love for the mortal children of all races. When Nurgle's attention is elsewhere, she whispers the cures for his plagues into the material universe, hoping that mortals will discover them when they are most needed. This tale, whether true or simply a comforting myth created by a grieving people, represents one of the few glimmers of hope in the otherwise unrelenting darkness of the fall's aftermath. Kurnos the hunter, Val the smith, Lilith the maiden, Morai Heg the crone, and all the other lesser gods of the Eldari pantheon met similar fates. Slaanesh consumed them one after another, their divine essences adding to the terrible power of the Prince of Pleasure. The gods who had once guided and protected the Eldari race were gone, absorbed into the very entity that their worshippers' corruption had created. The irony was not lost on those few Eldari who survived to reflect upon it. They had, in a sense, murdered their own gods, starving them through neglect and then feeding them to a monster of their own creation. Only 2 of the Eldari gods managed to escape Slaanesh's hunger in those first terrible moments. The first was Segurach, the laughing god, the trickster deity who had always walked at the edges of the pantheon. True to his nature, Segurach did not stand and fight. Instead, he fled into the labyrinth direction of the webway, disappearing into the infinite complexities of that ancient network of passages through space and time. Slaanesh pursued, driven by the need to complete its feast upon the Eldari pantheon. But in the twisting paths and impossible geometries of the webway, even a chaos god could become lost. Segurach eluded his pursuer, hiding in places where the Prince of Pleasure could not follow, and in doing so, preserved something of the old Eldari spirit for those who would later become his worshippers, the enigmatic Harlequins. The other survivor among the Eldari gods was Kain, the bloody-handed god, the deity of war and murder. Kain did not flee as Segurach did. Instead, true to his nature as a god of battle, he rose to meet Slaanesh in combat. The duel between them shook the foundations of the warp, 2 immense forces of divine power locked in struggle. The battle raged across impossible distances and through timeless eternities, with neither gaining a decisive advantage. Kain's martial prowess and fury were legendary even among gods, and though Slaanesh possessed greater raw power, the war god's skill and rage proved sufficient to hold the Prince of Pleasure at bay. But neither could Kain claim victory. Slaanesh was simply too powerful, too full of the stolen strength of the Eldari people to be defeated by any single god, even one as mighty as Kain. Eventually, the battle reached a stalemate, and in that moment of equilibrium, something unexpected occurred. Kain did not die, nor was he consumed as the other gods had been. Instead, his divine essence shattered, breaking into countless fragments that scattered across the galaxy. Each of these fragments, these splinters of a god's power, fell into the heart of the Eldari craft worlds that had escaped the initial catastrophe. There, in the wraithbone cores of those fleeing vessels, the fragments of kind took root and grew. They became what the Eldari would call the avatars of Kain, physical manifestations of the war god's fury that could be awakened in times of desperate need. Each craft world that survived the fall found itself host to one of these divine fragments, a piece of their shattered god that still burned with the rage and power that had defied even Slaanesh itself. The avatars would become focal points for the surviving Eldari's worship and martial traditions, living reminders that at least one of their gods had refused to be consumed without a fight. The destruction of the Eldari pantheon had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate loss of the gods themselves. For millions of years, when an Eldari died, their soul would dissolve peacefully back into the warp, eventually dissipating or being reborn according to the natural cycles of psychic energy. The gods of the pantheon had maintained a kind of spiritual ecosystem, a structure within the warp that allowed Eldari souls to follow their natural course without being preyed upon by the entities that dwelled in the immaterium. But with the gods devoured or scattered, that protection vanished. Now, when an Eldari died, their soul did not find peace or rebirth. Instead, it was drawn inexorably towards Slaanesh, pulled by a connection that the Dark Prince had forged with the Eldari race in the moment of its birth. This was perhaps Slaanesh's most insidious cruelty, the final twist of the knife in the wound it had inflicted upon the Eldari. Every member of the race, whether they had participated in the decadence that spawned the god or not, was now marked for eternity. Their psychically potent souls, which had once been their greatest gift, had become a curse. Each Eldari who died fed Slaanesh with their essence, adding their psychic energy to the god's power and experiencing torments beyond mortal comprehension in the process. The Eldari had not merely lost their empire and their gods, they had lost the very possibility of a peaceful death, condemned to an afterlife of eternal torment at the hands of a deity they themselves had created. The surviving Eldari, scattered across the galaxy in their craft worlds, in the webway's hidden reaches, and on distant Exodite worlds, found themselves confronting a reality more terrible than extinction. They were a dying race, their numbers catastrophically reduced, and with no hope of rebuilding what had been lost. Worse, they were a race without a future, for death now held not the promise of rest, but the certainty of damnation. Every child born to the surviving Eldari was born under this shadow, their fate sealed from the moment they drew their first breath. The fall had not simply destroyed the Eldari Empire, it had transformed the Eldari themselves into a species defined by loss, by guilt, and by the constant struggle to avoid the fate that awaited them beyond death. The craft worlds that had escaped the psychic shockwave of Slaanesh's birth found themselves adrift in a galaxy transformed almost beyond recognition. The massive vessels, each one a city unto itself, housing the last remnants of uncorrupted Eldari civilization, became isolated kingdoms wandering the void. The Eldari aboard these vessels would come to call themselves the Asuryani, a term meaning the children of Asurian, invoking the name of their dead Phoenix King as a reminder of what they had been and what they had lost. The Asuryani saw themselves as the inheritors of true Eldari culture, the keepers of the traditions and knowledge that had been consumed in the fall. The transformation from cosmopolitan citizens of a galaxy-spanning empire to isolated refugees struggling for survival was brutal and traumatic. The craft worlds had not been designed as permanent habitats. They were trading vessels, meant to spend centuries away from the homeworlds, but always with the understanding that they would eventually return. Now, there was no home to return to, only the Eye of Terror marking the grave of their civilization. The populations aboard each craftworld found themselves forced to become entirely self-sufficient, unable to rely on trade or support from other worlds as they once had. Every resource had to be carefully managed, every birth celebrated as a precious addition to dwindling numbers. Every death mourned, not just for the individual lost, but for what their loss meant to the fragile survival of their people. The Asuryani were not the only Eldari to survive the fall, though they were perhaps the most numerous. Deep within the webway, in hidden realms that had once served as pleasure palaces for the decadent elite, another group of Eldari endured. These survivors, who would come to be known as the Drukhari or Dark Eldar, had been at the very heart of the corruption that spawned Slaanesh. They were the members of the pleasure cults who had survived by virtue of being isolated within the webway when the psychic shockwave struck. Unlike the Asuryani, who fled from the depravity that had consumed their people, the Drukhari embraced it. They had tasted the heights of sensation that led to the fall, and they found themselves unable or unwilling to give it up, even in the face of their race's near extinction. The city of Commorragh, deep within the webway's darkest reaches, became the new capital of these twisted survivors. Originally a port and trading hub during the height of the Eldari Empire, Commorragh transformed into a nightmare realm where the worst excesses of the pleasure cults continued unabated. The Drukhari who dwelt there discovered that they could stave off Slaanesh's claim on their souls through a simple, if horrific, expedient. By inflicting suffering on others, by drinking in the pain and anguish of their victims, they could sustain themselves and delay the moment when the Dark Prince would claim them. This made them into predators, raiders who ventured out from Commorragh to capture victims from across the galaxy, dragging them back to their dark city to be tortured and murdered for the sustenance their suffering provided. The Drukhari represented everything the Asuryani had fled from, a dark mirror showing what the Eldari race would have become if the fall had not interrupted their descent. Yet both groups were Eldari, both shared the same psychic nature and the same doom waiting beyond death. The relationship between the Craftworld Eldari and their dark kindred in Commorragh was complex, marked by contempt, fear, and an uncomfortable recognition of shared heritage. The Asuryani saw the Drukhari as damned souls who had learned nothing from the fall, while the Drukhari viewed the Craftworld Eldari as hypocrites, denying their own nature, prisoners of a dead past who lacked the courage to embrace what they truly were. On the distant Exodite worlds at the galaxy's rim, yet another branch of the Eldari survived. The Exodites, who had fled the Empire before the fall, found their instincts vindicated in the most terrible way possible. Their decision to abandon technology and embrace a simpler existence in harmony with nature had saved them from the worst of the psychic shockwave. Their souls less exposed because their psychic potential was deliberately suppressed through their lifestyle choices. The Exodite worlds were too far from the core of the old empire to be consumed by the Eye of Terror, and their inhabitants had already purged themselves of the corruption that fed Slaanesh. The Exodites developed their own unique culture in the millennia following the fall, one that combined elements of Eldari tradition with a deep reverence for the natural world. They bonded with the great dragons that inhabited their maiden worlds, forming partnerships with these mighty creatures that provided both transportation and companionship. The world spirits of their planets, psychic entities formed from the collective life force of all living things on a world, became focus points for Exodite spirituality and protection. When an Exodite died, their soul would merge with the world spirit rather than being claimed by Slaanesh, finding a form of immortality in the Geistal consciousness of their planet. The Craftworld Asuryani, lacking the world spirits of the Exodites and unwilling to embrace the Drukhari's path of sustained atrocity, developed their own solution to the problem of Slaanesh's claim on their souls. They turned to the Spirit Stones, those crystalline tears that Isha had wept in ancient times to maintain connection with her mortal children. Eldari artisans called bone singers learned to grow these stones from wraith bone, shaping them to resonate with an individual's psychic signature. Every Eldari on the Craftworlds now wore a spirit stone from birth, a gem that would capture their soul at the moments of death and prevent it from being dragged into the warp and Slaanesh's waiting embrace. The spirit stones became the most precious resource in Craftworld society, more valuable than any material wealth because they represented the only chance for survival beyond death. When an Eldari died, their spirit stone was carefully recovered and placed within the Craftworld's infinity circuit, a massive psychic network woven through the wraithbone structure of the vessel itself. There, the souls of the dead could exist in a form of digital immortality, their consciousness preserved and their knowledge accessible to the living. In times of great need, these preserved souls could even be transferred into wraithbone constructs, animated war machines that allowed the dead to fight once more in defense of their people. But the spirit stones offered only a partial solution. They could preserve souls that were properly harvested, but they could not change the fundamental nature of the Eldari psyche. Every surviving Eldari was still a being of intense emotion and powerful psychic potential, still capable of the same excesses that had doomed their ancestors. The question facing the Craftworld survivors was how to prevent themselves from repeating the mistakes that had led to the fall. How could they remain true to their nature as Eldari while avoiding the trap of excess that had spawned Slaanesh in the first place? The answer they developed was the Path, a structured system of psychological discipline that would come to define Asuryani culture in the millennia following the fall. The Path was based on the recognition that the Eldari psyche was fundamentally different from that of other races, that their capacity for emotion and sensation was so great that it could easily overwhelm them if not carefully controlled. Rather than trying to suppress their nature entirely, which would be both impossible and contrary to what it meant to be Eldari, the Path channeled those intense feelings into specific, controlled pursuits. An Eldari following the Path would dedicate themselves entirely to a single pursuit for a period of years or decades, throwing themselves into it with all the passion and intensity of their nature. But this dedication was temporary and structured. When they felt they had learned all they could from one path, they would put it aside and move on to another, experiencing different aspects of existence without becoming trapped in any single one. There were paths for warriors, for artisans, for scholars, for leaders, each one offering a framework within which intense emotion and dedication could be safely expressed without spiraling into the kind of obsessive excess that had doomed the old empire. Some Eldari would walk many paths over the course of their long lives, accumulating experiences and wisdom from each one. Others would find a particular path so compelling that they would walk it for centuries, becoming masters of their chosen discipline. And some, tragically, would become lost upon a path, their personalities subsumed by their chosen role until they could no longer step away from it. These lost ones were both pitied and valued by Craftworld society. For while they had sacrificed their ability to change and grow, they had become exemplars of their chosen discipline, living embodiments of perfection in their particular field. The most dangerous of the paths was the path of the warrior, for it required Eldari to embrace the violence and aggression that was part of their nature, the legacy of Kain's gift of anger. Those who walked this path joined one of the aspect shrines, warrior societies each dedicated to a particular form of combat and embodying different facets of Kain's nature. The Dire Avengers exemplified noble warfare and defensive combat. The Howling Banshees channeled primal rage and terror. The Dark Reapers represented death and inevitable doom. Each aspect had its own rituals, its own armor and weapons, its own philosophy of war. When an Eldari donned the armor of their aspect and took up its weapons, they allowed themselves to become something other than their civilian self. The war mask, both literal and metaphorical, gave them permission to embrace the killer instinct that lurked within every Eldari soul. In battle, they could experience the rush of combat, the clarity of purpose that came from facing an enemy, the satisfaction of protecting their craft world and their people. But when the battle was done and they removed their armor, they were expected to put aside that warrior persona and return to civilian life, becoming once more the artist or scholar or craftsman they had been before. Not everyone could successfully walk away. Some warriors found that the armor fit too well, that the clarity of purpose they found in battle was too seductive to abandon. These individuals became exarchs, permanently trapped upon the path of the warrior, their consciousness merging with the spirits of previous exarchs preserved in their ancient armor. An exarch was no longer truly an individual, but rather a gestalt entity, a warrior who embodied the accumulated skill and experience of everyone who had worn that armor before. They served as the leaders and trainers of the aspect shrines, living legends who had sacrificed their own future to preserve the martial traditions that might one day save their people. The establishment of the Path and the other structures of post-fall Asuryani society represented a conscious choice to value survival and stability over the freedom and self-expression that had once defined Eldari civilization. The craft world Eldari had learned the terrible cost of unlimited freedom, and they chose instead to accept restrictions that would have been unthinkable to their ancestors. Every aspect of their lives became governed by ritual and tradition, by rules designed to prevent the kind of excess that had led to the fall. They became a people defined by caution and discipline, always aware that the slightest misstep could lead them down the same path that had destroyed their empire. This fundamental transformation in Eldari society was perhaps Slaanesh's most lasting victory. The god had not merely destroyed an empire or consumed the souls of trillions. It had forced the surviving Eldari to fundamentally change who and what they were, to deny aspects of their own nature in order to survive. The Eldari of the craft worlds were no longer the bold, passionate people who had once strode across the galaxy as its undisputed masters. They were survivors, refugees from their own history, living in the shadow of a catastrophe they could never forget and a threat they could never escape. As the craft worlds drifted through the galaxy in the millennia following the fall, they maintained contact with one another through the webway, that ancient network of passages that the Eldari had inherited from the old ones. The webway had survived the fall largely intact, its ancient structure proving resilient enough to weather even the psychic storm of Slaanesh's birth. But it was no longer the safe and reliable network it had once been. The catastrophic breach that created the Eye of Terror had damaged portions of the webway, creating instabilities and tears in its fabric. Demons had found ways into the network, infesting sections that had once been perfectly safe. Travel through the webway, while still far safer than venturing into the open warp, now carried risks that would have been unthinkable before the fall. The craft worlds themselves continue to evolve and develop, each one becoming increasingly distinct from the others as millennia of isolation shaped their individual cultures and traditions. Some craft worlds, like Otway, positioned themselves near the Eye of Terror, maintaining a vigil over the realm of their greatest shame and using their proximity to the warp rift to hone their psychic abilities. Others, like Bieltan, became militant and aggressive, dedicated to reclaiming the glory of the old empire by destroying the lesser races who had overrun former Eldari worlds during the chaos of the fall. Still others, like Iyanden, focused on maintaining population and rebuilding their numbers, only to suffer catastrophic losses to the Tyranid high fleets in later ages. The relationship between the craftworld Eldari and the younger races of the galaxy was complex and often troubled. When the fall occurred, humanity was still in the depths of the Age of Strife, its far-flung colonies cut off from one another by warp storms and descending into barbarism. But within a few thousand years of Slaanesh's birth, a new force arose on Terra. The Emperor of Mankind, that enigmatic and powerful figure who would unite Terra and launch the Great Crusade, was either born or revealed himself during this period. His imperium would spread across the galaxy during the next few centuries, reclaiming human worlds and establishing a new empire in spaces that had once belonged to the Eldari. The Asuryani watched this rise of humanity with mixed feelings. On one hand, they saw in humanity a young and vigorous species, free from the psychic corruption that plagued the Eldari and capable of repopulating worlds at a rate the Eldari could never match. On the other hand, humanity's expansion often brought them into conflict with Eldari interests, as the Imperium claimed worlds that the Craftworlds considered maiden worlds to be preserved for possible future Eldari colonization. The Eldari attempted to guide humanity when they could, sometimes appearing as mysterious benefactors offering cryptic advice, other times intervening more directly to prevent humans from making choices the Eldari considered catastrophic. These interventions were rarely appreciated by their human recipients, who often viewed the Eldari as arrogant aliens meddling in human affairs without explanation or justification. The Eldari practice of sacrificing human lives to preserve Eldari lives, which to them was simply logical given the relative scarcity and value of Eldari souls, struck humans as monstrous. Incidents where Eldari manipulated human factions into wars with one another to serve distant Eldari purposes only deepened human distrust and resentment. The relationship between the Imperium and the Craftworld Eldari would remain one of wary coexistence, punctuated by occasional cooperation and frequent conflict, neither side able to fully trust the other or find common ground despite facing many of the same threats. The Harlequins, those mysterious followers of Segorok who had escaped Slaanesh's hunger by hiding in the webway, developed a unique role in post-fall Eldari society. They traveled between all the different factions of surviving Eldari, welcomed in Craftworld, Exodite settlements, and even in Dark Commorragh, for they alone maintained connections across the fractured remnants of their race. The Harlequins were actors, dancers, and warriors who preserved Eldari history through elaborate performances of their mythic cycles, ritual dances that told the stories of the gods, the ancient days of the Empire, and most importantly, the fall itself. Through their performances, the Harlequins ensured that no Eldari could forget what had happened or why. They acted out the hubris and excess that had doomed the Empire, the warnings that went unheeded, the moment of Slaanesh's birth, and the destruction of the Pantheon. These performances were not mere entertainment. They were sacred rituals, acts of remembrance and warning that kept the memory of the fall alive in the collective consciousness of the Eldari race. To watch a Harlequin troupe perform the fall was to experience it vicariously, to feel something of the horror and loss that had defined their species' greatest tragedy. The Harlequins also served as messengers and diplomats, carrying information between craftworlds and occasionally acting as intermediaries in disputes. Their loyalty was not to any particular craftworld or faction, but to the Eldari race as a whole, and to their god Segorok, the laughing god who alone among the Pantheon had survived by refusing to fight. The Harlequins' philosophy reflected their god's nature, embracing trickery, misdirection, and the idea that the most powerful weapon was not strength but cunning. They walked a dangerous path, moving through the webway and occasionally even into realms of chaos itself, protected by their god's favor and their own considerable skill. Some among the Harlequins were chosen for an even more dangerous calling, becoming solitaires, lone performers who acted out the role of Slaanesh itself in the mythic cycles. This was a task so spiritually perilous that those who took it on knowingly condemned themselves. A solitaire soul was too tainted by their connection to the Dark Prince to be saved by a spirit stone or protected by Segorok's grace. When a solitaire died, their soul would be claimed by Slaanesh, dragged into eternal torment as payment for the knowledge they had gained through their dark role. Yet solitaires accepted this fate willingly, believing that their sacrifice served a greater purpose in preserving the memory of the fall and warning future generations against the path that led to it. Among the Craftworld Eldari, a special role emerged for those with the gift of prophecy and foresight. The Farseers, as they were called, were psychers of tremendous power who could perceive the skein of fate, seeing the branching paths of possible futures and the consequences of present actions. They guided their craftworlds through the dangers of the post-fall galaxy, using their visions to avoid threats and exploit opportunities. But this power came at a terrible cost. The more a Farseer used their abilities, the more they opened themselves to the currents of the warp, and the more they risked losing themselves entirely to their visions. Over time, over centuries of using their powers, a Farseer would begin to transform. Their physical body would start to crystallize, slowly turning into psychoactive stone, not unlike the wraithbone that formed their craftworld structure. This transformation was irreversible and inevitable, the price paid for the power to guide their people. Eventually, a Farseer would become entirely crystalline, their consciousness merging with the Craftworld's infinity circuit as their body became a living statue. In this final transformation, they achieved a kind of immortality, their wisdom and foresight preserved forever as part of their Craftworld's collective consciousness, but at the cost of everything that had made them individuals. The search for solutions to the threat posed by Slaanesh occupied the Eldari across all their various factions and disciplines. The Craftworld Eldari pursued their path system and spirit stone technology. The Exodites bonded with their world spirits. The Drukhari sustained themselves through the suffering of others. The Harlequins danced in the protection of Sigoric's shadow. Each approach offered partial protection, a way to delay or avoid she who thirsts claim on their souls. But none provided a complete solution. The fundamental problem remained unchanged. Every Eldari was marked by Slaanesh from birth, their souls irrevocably linked to the god they had unwittingly created. Some Eldari sought more radical solutions. Obscure cults and secret societies pursued forbidden knowledge, trying to find ways to permanently sever the connection between their race and the Dark Prince. These efforts ranged from the scholarly and methodical to the desperate and insane. Some researchers delved into the nature of soul binding and psychic resonance, hoping to discover a technique that could shield Eldari souls from Slaanesh's hunger. Others sought to harness the power of the remaining god fragments, believing that if Kine could be reassembled, or if Isha could be rescued from Nurgle's garden, the restored deities might protect their children once more. Perhaps the most ambitious and controversial of these efforts was the Inad project, pursued primarily by the Craftworld Iyanden, but discussed in hushed whispers across Craftworld society. This effort was based on a radical theory of how to create a new god. The Eldari had accidentally created Slaanesh through the collective psychic resonance of their civilization's depravity. What if they could deliberately create a new god through a different kind of collective effort? What if the souls of dead Eldari, preserved in spirit stones and infinity circuits rather than being consumed by Slaanesh, could eventually accumulate enough psychic mass to coalesce into a new deity? This new god, which they named Yanad, the god of the dead, would theoretically be powerful enough to challenge and perhaps even destroy Slaanesh. It would be born from the souls of the Eldari dead rather than from their corruption, an entity of preservation rather than excess, death rather than torment. The project required patience beyond measure, for it depended on accumulating the souls of dead Eldari across millennia. Every spirit stone that successfully preserved a soul, every Eldari who died and was laid to rest in an infinity circuit rather than being claimed by Slaanesh, brought the birth of Yanad slightly closer. But this solution, if it could even be called that, had a dark implication buried at its heart. For Yanad to be born with enough power to threaten Slaanesh, it would require an enormous number of Eldari souls, possibly all the souls of all the Eldari who had died since the fall, and all who would die in the future. The birth of Yanad might require the death of the Eldari race itself, the sacrifice of the last living Eldari to create a god that would avenge them by destroying Slaanesh. It was a solution born of desperation, a plan that traded certain extinction for the mere possibility of post-Mestis revenge.
The Eye of Terror itself continued to be a source of horror and fascination for the Eldari. The crone worlds that lay within it, the former heart of their empire, now transformed into demon realms, held treasures beyond price and dangers beyond comprehension. Ancient artifacts of the lost empire, weapons and tools crafted in the Golden Age before the fall, lay waiting in the ruins of those twisted worlds. Spirit stones containing the souls of Eldari who died before the evacuation could be rescued and brought back to the Craftworlds, saving those souls from an eternity of torment. Knowledge preserved in libraries and data vaults might provide insights into Eldari history and technology that had been lost in the chaos of the fall. But venturing into the Eye meant facing demons, Chaos Space Marines, and the ever-present risk of Slaanesh's direct attention. The Eye of Terror was, in many ways, Slaanesh's personal domain, the realm where the Dark Prince's power was strongest. Any Eldari entering that realm was walking into the mouth of the beast, gambling their soul against whatever reward they sought. Yet some Eldari made this terrible choice, driven by duty, desperation, or the faint hope that they might recover something precious from their lost past. The Harlequins, with their unique connection to Segarak and their mastery of the webway, were the most frequent travelers into the Eye. They mounted expeditions to recover artifacts or rescue lost Eldari souls, protected by their god's trickery and their own remarkable skill. These ventures were known as Black Library raids when they sought knowledge from the mysterious Black Library, a repository of forbidden lore hidden somewhere in the webway that was said to contain truths about the Chaos Gods and how they might be fought. The Harlequins who served as guardians of the Black Library were among the most secretive and dangerous of all Eldari, privy to knowledge that could destroy minds and wielding understanding of chaos that would seem heretical to other Eldari factions. The relationship between Slaanesh and the Eldari was not simply one of predator and prey, though that dynamic certainly existed. There was something more personal, more intimate about the connection between the Dark Prince and its progenitor race. Slaanesh was, in a real sense, the child of the Eldari, born from their collective psyche and embodying aspects of their nature taken to hideous extremes. The god was obsessed with its parent race, pursuing Eldari souls with a hunger that exceeded its interest in other species. An Eldari soul was a delicacy to Slaanesh, richer and more satisfying than the souls of lesser races, perhaps because of the irony involved, or perhaps because the psychic resonance between god and race made Eldari souls particularly nourishing. This meant that the Eldari could never truly hide from Slaanesh. The Dark Prince was always aware of them, always watching, always waiting for the moment when they would let down their guard. Every time an Eldari felt intense emotion, every time they pushed the boundaries of experience even slightly, they risked drawing Slaanesh's attention. The god whispered to them in moments of passion or pain, offering power and pleasure beyond imagination in exchange for just a small opening, just a tiny breach in the psychological defenses they had erected. Those who listened, who gave in even slightly to those whispers, often found themselves on a downward spiral from which there was no return, their souls slowly being drawn toward the god even while they still lived. Among the Drukhari of Commorragh, this dance with Slaanesh took on its most explicit and terrible form. The Dark Eldar knew that Slaanesh was slowly consuming their souls from the moment of their birth, that the Dark Prince was taking them piece by piece even while they lived. Their only defense was to give Slaanesh something else to feed on, to offer up the suffering of their victims as a substitute for their own essence. This created a nightmarish economy where suffering was literally currency, where a Drukhari's life could be measured in the anguish they inflicted on others. The more pain they caused, the longer they could stave off the moment when Slaanesh would claim the last fragment of their soul and drag them into eternal torment. This system created a society built entirely around sadism and cruelty, where compassion was weakness and mercy was suicide. The Drukhari raided across the galaxy, capturing victims from every species to fuel their dark city's needs. Their technologies for prolonging life and inflicting pain had advanced to heights that would seem like dark miracles to other races. They could keep a victim alive and aware through injuries that should have killed them instantly, extracting every possible moment of suffering before finally allowing death. They had developed weapons that didn't merely kill, but did so in ways designed to maximize the terror and pain experienced in the final moments of life. Yet even in Dark Commorragh, there were hierarchies and structures that prevented complete chaos. The Cabals, powerful organizations led by archons who had survived for millennia through cunning and ruthlessness, maintained a brutal order. The Homunculi covens, comprised of twisted flesh-clafters who had learned to reshape living tissue according to their whims, offered their services to any who could pay their terrible prices. The Wyche cults provided entertainment through gladiatorial combat, where skill in dealing death was celebrated as the highest art form. And above them all, in the shadows, moved the mysterious Court of the Archon, led by the ancient Asdrubal Vecht, who had ruled Dark Commorragh for longer than some races had existed. The Drukhari represented what the Eldari might have become if the fall had never happened, if they had been allowed to continue their descent into depravity indefinitely. In a sense, they were the most honest of all the surviving Eldari factions, for they did not pretend to be anything other than what they were. They had embraced the darkness within the Eldari soul rather than fighting against it, and they had built a civilization around that darkness that had endured for 10,000 years. The Craftworld Eldari might condemn them as damned monsters, but the Drukhari would respond that at least they were free, unshackled by the restrictions and denials that made Craftworld life a prison of self-imposed rules. The Exodites, living on their distant worlds in relative isolation, represented yet another path forward for the Eldari species. They had rejected both the Craftworld path system and the Drukhari's embrace of darkness, in favor of a simpler existence in harmony with nature. Their lives were harder than those of their Craftworld cousins, requiring physical labor and exposing them to dangers that automated systems might have prevented. But there was something pure about the Exodite existence, an honesty and directness that the more sophisticated factions had lost. When an Exodite died, their soul merged with the world spirit of their planet, becoming part of something larger than themselves while still maintaining individual identity within the Gestalt. The Exodites bonded with great dragons, magnificent creatures that were native to many of the Maiden Worlds and which seemed to have some kind of natural resistance to chaos corruption. These bonds were deep and spiritual, going beyond mere partnership to become a kind of shared consciousness. A dragon and its rider could fight as one, moving with perfect coordination born of their psychic link. The dragons themselves came in many varieties, from swift and agile megadons used as cavalry mounts to massive dragon kings whose size rivaled imperial titans. These creatures were honored and revered by the Exodites, seen as sacred partners in their way of life. Despite their rejection of advanced technology, the Exodites were far from helpless in the face of threats. When enemies came to their worlds seeking to claim them for expansion or exploitation, the Exodites could call upon the world spirit itself for aid. The entire ecosystem of their planet might rise up against invaders, as if the land itself were fighting to repel them. Ancient weapons stored for emergencies would be awakened, technology that the Exodites normally shunned, but which they kept in reserve for moments of true need. And the dragons, those mighty beasts who had become the Exodites' companions and guardians, would take to the skies or shake the earth with their passage, defending their homes and their bonded partners with ferocity that no enemy could mistake. As the millennia passed after the fall, the various factions of surviving Eldari developed increasingly distinct cultures and identities. The unity that had once characterized the Eldari Empire was gone, replaced by separate civilizations that happened to share a common ancestry and a common doom. The Craftworld Eldari saw themselves as the true inheritors of Eldari civilization, preserving its noblest traditions while learning from its greatest mistakes. The Drukhari considered themselves the only ones honest enough to embrace the Eldari nature fully, seeing the Craftworld path system as cowardly denial. The Exodites had left all that behind, finding their own way in the wild places of the galaxy. The Harlequins alone moved between all these groups, maintaining fragile connections and reminding all Eldari of their shared history. Yet, despite their differences and occasional conflicts, all Eldari remained bound by their common relationship with Slaanesh. She who thirsts cared nothing for the political divisions or philosophical disagreements between Eldari factions. Whether an Eldari followed the path or lived in dark Commorragh, whether they bonded with dragons on Exodite worlds or danced in Sigordagoth's shadow, all were equally marked as prey. This shared doom was perhaps the only thing that still united them as a people, the one undeniable truth that no faction could ignore or escape. The passage of 10,000 years since the fall brought changes to the galaxy that profoundly affected the surviving Eldari. Humanity, that young and vigorous species that had been struggling through its age of strife when Slaanesh was born, had risen to dominate the galaxy in ways the Eldari never had, even at their height. The Imperium of Man claimed millions of worlds, its armies numbered in the countless billions, and though individual humans were weak compared to Eldari, their sheer numbers made them a force that could not be ignored. The Eldari watched this rise with mixed feelings, seeing in humanity both hope and threat, potential allies and inevitable enemies. The Imperium's expansion brought it into contact and often conflict with Eldari interests across the galaxy. Human colonists settled on maiden worlds that the Eldari had preserved for possible future use, transforming pristine ecosystems into farmland and cities. Imperial military forces stumbled into webway passages, breaching the ancient network and sometimes bringing chaos corruption with them. Craftworlds attempting to manipulate events to preserve Eldari interests found themselves facing Imperial responses that, while crude and unsophisticated, were effective through sheer overwhelming force. The relationship between the two species was characterized by mutual incomprehension and frequent bloodshed. Yet there were also moments of cooperation, temporary alliances formed against common threats. When the Tyranid Hive fleets began their invasion of the galaxy, both species recognized that these extragalactic devourers represented an existential threat to all life. The forces of chaos, empowered by the Eye of Terror and spreading their corruption across the stars, were enemies to both Imperium and Craftworld alike. In these moments, Eldari and humans sometimes fought side by side, their profound differences temporarily set aside in the face of greater dangers. These alliances were always fragile and temporary, breaking down as soon as the immediate threat was defeated, but they suggested that cooperation might be possible if both species could overcome their mutual distrust. The Eldari seers and farseers, gazing into the possible futures with their prophetic gifts, saw a galaxy teetering on the edge of multiple apocalypses. They saw the Tyranids, those chitinous horrors from beyond the galactic rim, consuming world after world in their inexorable advance. They saw the Necrons awakening from their millennia-long slumber, ancient machines bent on reclaiming the galaxy they had once ruled. They saw the forces of chaos growing stronger, the other Chaos gods joining Slaanesh in their eternal war against reality itself. And they saw the Imperium, vast and powerful, but also corrupt and dying, holding back the darkness through faith and sacrifice, but slowly crumbling under the weight of its own size and internal contradictions. In these visions, the Eldari saw their own future as well, and it was not encouraging. Their numbers continue to decline, each generation smaller than the last, despite every effort to preserve and protect their dwindling population. The craft worlds, magnificent as they were artifacts from another age, and the knowledge of how to build new ones had been lost in the fall. They could maintain what they had, repair damage and preserve existing structures, but they could not replace what was destroyed. Every craft world lost to disaster or war was an irreplaceable blow, taking with it thousands or even millions of Eldari souls and reducing still further the remnants of their once mighty race. The prophecies spoke of many possible endings for the Eldari. Some visions showed them fading away entirely, the last of their kind dying alone on distant craft worlds while the galaxy moved on without them, their entire civilization becoming nothing more than ruins for younger races to study and wonder at. Other visions showed them consumed by Slaanesh, the Dark Prince finally claiming the last of its prey and gorging itself on the accumulated souls it had been hunting for 10 millennia. Still other prophecies suggested that Yinad might one day be born and challenge Slaanesh, though whether this would save the Eldari or simply provide them with a dramatic ending remained unclear. But there were also prophecies that spoke of a different possibility, a chance, however slim, for the Eldari to reclaim something of what they had lost. These visions were fragmentary and difficult to interpret, showing moments of significance whose meaning remained obscure. They spoke of the Ranadandra, the final battle between the Eldari and the forces of chaos, a last stand where the fate of the species would be decided once and for all. They showed Eldrad Ulthron, the most powerful Farseer of Craftworld Ulthwé, working across millennia on schemes so complex that even other Farseers could barely glimpse their outlines. They hinted at the Eldari's role in a greater cosmic drama whose final act had not yet been written. The Ynnari, a relatively new faction that emerged in recent times, represented one such dramatic development in the Eldari struggle against their doom. This movement, led by Yvrain, the emissary of Yinad, was based on the belief that the god of the dead need not wait for all Eldari to die before being born. Through specific rituals and by collecting the souls of the dead in certain ways, they believed they could hasten Yinad's birth and bring about the god's confrontation with Slaanesh while there were still living Eldari to benefit from it. The Ynnari drew followers from all Eldari factions, bringing together Craftworld Asuryani, Drukhari from Commorragh, Exodites, and even Harlequins in an unprecedented alliance. This movement was controversial, to put it mildly. Many conservative elements within Craftworld society saw the Ynnari as dangerous radicals whose tampering with forces beyond their understanding might bring about the very extinction they claimed to be preventing. The worship of Yinad itself was problematic, for it was worship of death, and there were those who wondered whether a god born from death would truly be a savior or simply another form of damnation. Yet the Ynnari continued to grow, drawing those Eldari who were tired of endless decline and who wanted to take action, however risky, rather than simply accepting their slow extinction. The fracture of Biel-Tan, a recent catastrophe where one of the greatest craft worlds was shattered by demonic assault, seemed to many Eldari to validate the Ynnari's urgency. If even the mighty craft worlds were no longer safe, if chaos could breach their defenses and destroy them despite millennia of careful preparation, then perhaps radical action was indeed necessary. The birth of the Incarn, the avatar of Yanad that manifested during Bielsan's darkest hour, suggested that the god of the dead was already stirring, already gathering strength, even though its full birth remained incomplete. The Eye of Terror itself had grown more active in recent times, its boundaries expanding as the power of chaos waxed strong. The Great Rift, also called the Cicatrix Maledictum, had torn across the galaxy following the events surrounding the return of the Primarch Robout Guilliman and the fall of Cadia. This massive warp storm, larger even than the Eye of Terror, had split the Imperium in half and created regions where the warp bled directly into real space across vast areas. For the Eldari, this represented both a threat and a strange opportunity. The weakening of the barrier between the material universe and the immaterium made their psychic power stronger, but also made them more vulnerable to demonic assault and to Slaanesh's hunger. Within the expanding Eye of Terror, demon princes and champions of Slaanesh ruled over crone worlds that were twisted parodies of the paradise planets they had once been. Some of these beings were Eldari themselves, members of the old pleasure cults who had survived the fall by ascending to daemonhood, trading their Eldari nature for immortality as servants of the Dark Prince. These fallen Eldari who remembered the Empire at its height and had participated in its corruption represented perhaps the darkest mirrors of all for the surviving Eldari. They were living proof of what could have happened to all of them, the final form that the pleasure cults might have taken if given more time. The craft welders, who occasionally ventured into the Eye to recover artifacts or rescue lost souls, sometimes encountered these fallen kindred. The meetings were invariably terrible, for the Daemon Princes and Chaos Champions retained fragments of their old selves, enough to remember what they had been and to mock what they had become. They would try to tempt their still-living cousins, offering power and pleasure beyond imagining, whispering that resistance was futile and that eventually all Eldari would belong to Slaanesh. Some who heard these whispers were lost, drawn into corruption despite all their training and discipline. Others escaped but were forever changed by what they had seen and heard, carrying psychological scars that no healer could fully mend. The worship of Slaanesh continued to spread among certain populations across the galaxy, not just among Chaos Space Marines, but also among humans and other species who found themselves drawn to the Dark Prince's promises. These cults were a constant source of pain for the Eldar, for they were reminders that the corruption which had destroyed their empire could still claim victims, that the lesson of the fall had not been learned by the wider galaxy. Each new cult that arose, each new convert who pledged themselves to She Who Thirsts, added infinitesimally to the god's power and made the Eldari situation marginally worse. Yet the Eldar persevered, as they had persevered for 10,000 years. They continued to walk their paths on the craft worlds, maintaining the discipline that kept them safe from their own natures. They continued to raid and torture in Dark Commorragh, feeding Slaanesh with the suffering of others to preserve themselves a little longer. They continued to tend their maiden worlds as Exodites, living in harmony with the wild places and the great dragons who were their companions. They continued to dance and fight as harlequins, preserving the memory of what had been and what might someday be again. In all their various forms and factions, the Eldar endured. The story of the fall, preserved in the ritual dances of the Harlequins and in the collective memory of every Eldari alive, served as both warning and motivation. It was a reminder of the terrible price of hubris and excess, of what happens when a species loses sight of wisdom in pursuit of sensation. But it was also a testament to survival, to the fact that even after the worst catastrophe imaginable, even after their gods were slain and their empire destroyed, the Eldar had found ways to continue. They were diminished, certainly. They were marked for eternal damnation. But they were not extinct, and as long as a single Eldari drew breath, there remained the possibility, however slim, that they might find some way to change their fate. The Laughing God's followers spoke in whispers of the great joke at the heart of existence, the cosmic jest that Sigurok had perceived when he fled Slaanesh into the webway. Some said this joke was that the Eldar had created their own destroyer, becoming the authors of their own damnation. Others insisted the joke was that Slaanesh, for all its terrible power, could never truly destroy the Eldari, because in doing so it would destroy itself, severing the connection that gave it special power over the race that birthed it. Still others claimed the joke was yet to be revealed, that the punchline would only become clear in the final moment of the Ranadandra, when all debts were settled and all fates determined. The Black Library, that mysterious repository of forbidden knowledge guarded by the Harlequins deep within the webway, supposedly contained the most complete accounts of the fall and its causes. The library was said to hold books written by Eldari who had witnessed the pleasure cult's formation, who had tried to warn their people and been ignored. It held prophecies written by seers who had foreseen the birth of Slaanesh but could not find words terrible enough to make their contemporaries believe. It held technical analyses of how the Eldari's collective psychic resonance had gradually shaped the warp, creating the conditions for a new god's birth. And it held darker things as well, forbidden knowledge about chaos and the nature of the gods that could destroy the mind of anyone who learned it unprepared. Access to the Black Library was restricted to an extreme degree, with only the most trusted and powerful of the Harlequins permitted to enter its halls and consult its texts. The guardians of the library, warriors of legendary skill and unshakable will, stood watch over knowledge that could save the galaxy or doom it, depending on who wielded it. They turned away even high-ranking Farseers and Phoenix Lords who sought entrance without proper authorization, for the library's secrets were too dangerous to be shared freely even among the Eldari themselves. The knowledge within could be a weapon against chaos, but in the wrong hands or minds, it could become a vector for corruption more insidious than any daemon's whisper. The Phoenix Lords, those ancient and legendary warriors who had founded the Aspect Warrior Shrines in the years following the fall, remained as living connections to the Eldari's past. Each Phoenix Lord was not a single individual, but rather a consciousness that passed from body to body, inhabiting the sacred armor that bore their name and preserving the accumulated skill and knowledge of everyone who had ever worn it. Asurmen, the Hand of Asurian, had been the first Phoenix Lord, establishing the tradition from which all others sprang. Jane Zar, the Storm of Silence, led the Howling Banshees in their primal war cries. Karandras, the Shadow Hunter, walked unseen among the striking scorpions. Fugan, a burning lance, embodied the fire of the fire dragons. These legendary figures appeared in times of great need, manifesting on craft worlds that faced overwhelming threats and leading the Aspect Warriors in battle. Their presence was both inspiring and unsettling, for they were reminders of how far the Eldari had fallen. The Phoenix Lords had been among the first to recognize the need for martial discipline in the wake of the fall, among the first to understand that the Eldari could not simply disarm and become a race of pure artists and philosophers while threats still existed in the galaxy. They had created the Aspect Warrior Temples as a way to channel aggression and violence through safe, controlled channels, preventing the kind of excess that had led to the fall while still maintaining the ability to defend against enemies. Each Phoenix Lord carried with them memories of the fall, having lived through it or inherited memories from those who had. They remembered the horror of those final days, the psychic pressure building to unbearable levels, the screams that echoed through the warp as Slaanesh was born. They remembered the moment when they realized their entire civilization was dying, that nothing could stop the catastrophe that was unfolding. And they remembered the desperate struggle to save what could be saved, to evacuate the craft worlds and establish the systems that would allow the survivors to endure. These memories, preserved across thousands of years through the continuity of their sacred armor, made the Phoenix Lords living chronicles of the Eldari's greatest tragedy. The infinity circuits of the craft worlds, those vast networks of wraithbone infused with the souls of the dead, represented the closest thing the Eldari had to a collective afterlife. Within the circuit, the dead could communicate with one another and with the living, their consciousness preserved in a state that was neither true life nor complete death. They could offer counsel to the living, drawing on their accumulated wisdom and experience. They could be consulted about events they had witnessed or knowledge they had possessed. And in times of war, they could be transferred into wraithbone constructs, given temporary physical form to fight once more in defense of their craft world. The Wraith Lords and Wraith Knights, massive constructs animated by the souls of dead Eldari warriors, were both awesome weapons of war and walking tombs. Each one contained the spirit of an Eldari who had agreed to continue fighting even after death, their consciousness bound into the wraithbone shell and guided by the psychic direction of a living pilot, or operating independently according to protocols established when they were transferred. To encounter a Wraith Lord or Wraith Knight in battle was to face not just a machine, but the will of an Eldari who had died defending their people and chosen to continue that defense beyond death itself. The process of creating these constructs was considered sacred, a way of honoring the dead while also making practical use of their continued existence. Not every Eldari soul was suited for this purpose. It required a certain strength of will and clarity of purpose to maintain coherent consciousness within a wraithbone shell, to resist the pull toward dissolution into the greater gestalt of the infinity circuit. Those who succeeded became revered protectors, their names remembered and honored by the craft world they defended. Those who could not maintain individual coherence would gradually merge with the circuit, their memories and experiences becoming part of the collective whole rather than remaining distinct. The relationship between the living Eldari and the dead souls in the infinity circuits was complex and deeply spiritual. The living could draw comfort from knowing that death did not mean true separation, that they might speak with lost loved ones through the circuit, and that those loved ones would continue to exist in some form rather than being consumed by Slaanesh. But there was also sorrow in this arrangement, for the souls in the infinity circuit were not truly alive. They could not grow or change significantly. They could not experience new things or form new relationships in any meaningful way. They existed in a kind of stasis, preserved but not living, aware but limited in their ability to affect the world of matter and flesh. Some Eldari philosophers questioned whether this was truly preferable to dissolution into the warp, whether existing forever as a preserved consciousness in a wraithbone network was really better than whatever natural cycle of death and rebirth the Eldari might have experienced before Slaanesh's birth. These questions were usually raised only in private meditation or in discussions among the most trusted companions, for to suggest that the Spirit Stone system might not be the salvation it was presented as bordered on heresy in Craftworld society. The Infinity Circuits and Spirit Stones were the foundation upon which post-fall Eldari civilization was built. To question them was to question everything. The webway itself, that ancient network of passages through which the Eldari moved across the galaxy, bore scars from the fall that had never fully healed. Sections of the network had collapsed or become corrupted, infested with demons that had found ways in through breaches in its structure. The Eldari, who served as guardians of the webway, maintaining its gates and protecting its passages, fought a constant battle against these incursions. They repaired damage where they could, sealed off sections that were too corrupted to save, and worked to prevent the network from degrading further. But they knew they were fighting a losing battle, for the knowledge of how the webway had been originally constructed was lost, and all they could do was maintain and defend what remained. The various gates and passages of the webway had become precious strategic assets, fought over by different factions and carefully guarded by those who controlled them. Some gates opened onto craft worlds, providing safe passage between the material universe and the webway network. Others connected to Exodite worlds or hidden sanctuaries scattered across the galaxy. A few gates, perhaps the most dangerous of all, opened into the Eye of Terror itself, allowing access to the Crone worlds for those brave or foolish enough to enter that nightmare realm. Control of webway gates meant control of movement across the galaxy, the ability to strike anywhere and retreat to safety faster than any enemy could respond. The Imperium had long sought to understand and exploit the webway for its own purposes, recognizing the strategic value of such a transportation network. The Emperor himself had been working on a human-controlled webway project before his internment on the Golden Throne, seeking to free humanity from dependence on warp travel through the use of the ancient network. The Eldari viewed these efforts with alarm, seeing in them the potential for catastrophe. Humans did not understand the webway's delicate nature, the careful maintenance it required, the dangers that lurked in its depths. Imperial forces stumbling into the network or attempting to breach it from the outside had caused damage that took years of careful work to repair, and had occasionally let demons into previously secure sections. Yet, despite these concerns, the Eldari sometimes worked with humans to defend shared webway passages when greater threats appeared. Chaos invasions that threatened to breach the webway from within drew responses from both species, for neither wanted to see the ancient network fall completely under demonic control. These temporary alliances were marked by mutual suspicion and frequent misunderstandings, with neither side fully trusting the other. But the practical reality of shared threats sometimes overcame ideological differences, at least temporarily. The Eldari relationship with time itself had become complicated since the fall. Their psychic nature meant they experienced time differently from baseline humans, with memories that remained vivid across centuries and an ability to perceive the flow of cause and effect in ways that shorter-lived species could not match. This gave them a perspective on events that was both blessing and curse. They could see patterns unfolding across generations, could understand the long-term consequences of actions in ways humans rarely managed. But this also meant they remembered the fall with terrible clarity, that the trauma of those events remained fresh even after 10,000 years. No Eldari could forget what had happened, and the weight of that memory pressed on every decision they made. The seers who could perceive the branching paths of possibility saw time as even stranger than their fellows experienced it. To them, past, present, and future existed simultaneously in complex webs of causality and consequence. They could see how a decision made today might ripple forward through centuries, creating outcomes that seemed completely unrelated to the initial action. This ability to perceive what they called the skein of fate made them invaluable guides for their craft worlds, but it also isolated them from others. To see all possible futures was to know that most of them ended in tragedy, that the paths leading to favorable outcomes were narrow and difficult to navigate. The prophecies surrounding the Ranadandra, the final battle that would decide the fate of the Eldari, remained deliberately ambiguous and open to interpretation. Some Farseers believed this battle would be a literal military engagement, a last stand where all surviving Eldari would gather to face chaos in one final desperate struggle. Others interpreted it more metaphorically, seeing it as a spiritual or psychic confrontation rather than a physical war. Still others suggested that the Ranadandra might already be happening, unfolding across centuries rather than taking place in a single dramatic moment. Each battle against chaos and each Eldari death adding to the cumulative total that would eventually determine whether the species survived or perished. The role of the younger races in this prophecy remained unclear. Would humanity, the Tau, and other species fight alongside the Eldari in the final battle, or would they be irrelevant to a conflict that transcended material concerns? Some visions suggested that the fate of all species would be decided together, that the Ranadandra was not just about the Eldari, but about whether ordered reality would continue to exist or be consumed entirely by chaos. Other interpretations saw the younger races as obstacles or even enemies. beings whose ignorance and recklessness made them tools of chaos, whether they intended to be or not. The Eldari artifacts scattered across the galaxy, remnants of their lost empire, represented both treasures and dangers. Ancient weapons of terrible power lay forgotten in ruins on dead worlds. Psychic technologies that could reshape reality if properly activated gathered dust in places no living being had visited in millennia. Libraries containing knowledge that the Eldari had spent millions of years accumulating waited in silence for readers who might never come. These artifacts drew treasure hunters and archaeologists from many species, humans and others who sought to claim Eldari technology for themselves without understanding the forces they were meddling with. The Eldari themselves sought these artifacts when they could, trying to recover pieces of their heritage before they were destroyed or fell into the wrong hands. Some recovered artifacts were placed in Craftworld museums, carefully preserved as reminders of what had been lost. Others were studied and their principles incorporated into current technology, allowing the Eldari to rebuild small portions of the capabilities their ancestors had possessed. And some, the most dangerous ones, were kept locked away in secure vaults, their power too great and their corruption too deep to risk using them even in desperate circumstances. Among the most sought-after artifacts were the Tears of Isha, fragments of ancient crystals said to have been formed from the goddess's weeping for her mortal children. These crystals supposedly had the power to heal any wound, cure any disease, and even restore life to those recently dead. Whether such artifacts truly existed or were merely legends born from the Eldari's grief for their lost goddess remained debatable. Many expeditions had sought the tears across the centuries, venturing into the Eye of Terror or to distant ruins, but none had returned with definitive proof. Yet the legend persisted, offering hope that perhaps some trace of Isha's power and compassion might still exist in the material universe. The war masks worn by aspect warriors served a crucial psychological purpose in Eldari society beyond their practical function as protective equipment. When an Eldari donned the mask of their aspect, they were not simply putting on armor. They were invoking a persona, a psychological construct that allowed them to compartmentalize the violence and aggression necessary for war while maintaining their civilian identity intact. The mask was both literal and metaphorical, a physical object and a mental technique that kept the warrior self separate from the everyday self. This separation was crucial for preventing Eldari from becoming lost on the path of the warrior. The war mask allowed them to channel Kain's gift of anger and martial prowess while in battle, then set those qualities aside when they returned to civilian life. Without this psychological barrier, the intensity of combat, the rush of adrenaline, and the satisfaction of victory could become addictive in ways that echoed the pleasure-seeking that had doomed the old empire. The mask system had been developed through hard experience in the centuries following the fall, refined through trial and error as the survivors learned how to be warriors without losing themselves to war. Yet not everyone succeeded. The exarchs, those who became permanently trapped in their war masks, represented the system's failures as much as its successes. These individuals had allowed the warrior persona to consume their civilian self, had crossed a line from which there was no return. But rather than casting them out or putting them to death, Craftworld society found a use for them. Exarchs became teachers and leaders, their permanent commitment to war making them exemplars of martial perfection even as it marked them as cautionary tales about the dangers of losing oneself to a single pursuit. The music and art of the post-fall Eldari reflected the trauma and loss that defined their civilization. Where the art of the old empire had celebrated beauty, joy, and the endless pursuit of perfection, the art of the survivors was marked by melancholy and restraint. Eldari musicians composed elegies for their lost gods and laments for dead worlds. Painters captured the beauty of what remained while acknowledging what had been destroyed. Poets wrote in forms that deliberately limited their expression, using strict meters and complex structures to impose discipline on emotions that might otherwise overwhelm both creator and audience. This artistic restraint was another manifestation of the path system, a way of channeling creative impulses through controlled frameworks rather than allowing them to spiral into the kind of excess that had led to the fall. An Eldari walking the path of the artist would dedicate themselves to a particular artistic discipline, mastering its techniques and forms while always remaining aware of the boundaries that kept safe expression separate from dangerous obsession. They learned to find satisfaction in the discipline itself, in the mastery of difficult techniques and the creation of work within strict parameters, rather than in the endless pursuit of novelty and intensity that had consumed their ancestors. The story singers who preserved Eldari history through oral tradition performed an essential function in maintaining cultural continuity across the scattered remnants of their civilization. These individuals had committed to memory vast amounts of lore, including accounts of events from before the fall, genealogies of important families, technical specifications for ancient devices, and philosophical treatises from dead masters. They traveled between craft worlds when possible, sharing knowledge and ensuring that information lost on one vessel might be preserved on another. Their performances were both entertainment and education, teaching younger Eldari about their heritage while providing those who remembered with opportunities to revisit and reflect upon their past. The Eldari concept of the soul had become increasingly complex in the millennia since the fall. Before Slaanesh's birth, an Eldari soul was simply the psychic essence of an individual, the animating force that gave them life and personality. But now the soul had become something to be carefully guarded, preserved, and ultimately trapped in a spirit stone rather than being allowed to follow its natural course into the warp. This transformation had philosophical implications that scholars debated endlessly. Was a soul trapped in a spirit stone truly the same as a free soul? Did the infinity circuit preserve authentic consciousness or merely a simulation, an echo of the person who had died? Could existence within the circuit be considered a form of life, or was it simply an alternative to death? These questions had no definitive answers, but they mattered deeply to individual Eldari as they contemplated their own mortality. The knowledge that death would not end their existence provided some comfort, but it was cold comfort at best. The alternative, being claimed by Slaanesh and experiencing eternal torment, was so terrible that any other option seemed preferable by comparison. Yet this did not prevent Eldari from feeling profound sorrow at the loss of what their ancestors had possessed, the natural cycle of death and rebirth that had been stolen from them by the god their civilization had created. The maiden worlds that the Eldari had preserved during their empire's height had become contested territories in the current age. These pristine planets, kept deliberately uninhabited and allowed to develop their ecosystems without intervention, had been maintained as reserves for future colonization. But with the Eldari population so reduced and scattered, they lacked the numbers to settle these worlds themselves. Other species, particularly humanity, with its endless hunger for new territories, saw the maiden worlds as unclaimed resources ripe for exploitation. The conflicts over these worlds were frequent and bitter, with neither side willing to compromise on what they saw as rightful claims. The Exodites, who had settled on some maiden worlds before the fall, defended them ferociously against all intruders, whether human colonists, orc invasions, or other threats. These defenders saw themselves as stewards of worlds that belonged to the Eldari as a species, preserving them for a future that might never come, but which they refused to abandon hope of reaching. When Imperial colony ships arrived in orbit over a maiden world, they often found Exodites already present and unwilling to share or surrender. The resulting conflicts could be devastating for the human colonists, who rarely understood what they were facing until it was too late. The Wraithbone technology that formed the foundation of Eldari material culture had evolved significantly since the fall, driven by necessity and the loss of many advanced techniques. The bone singers who shaped Wraithbone through psychic song had developed new methods for repairing damaged structures, growing replacement components, and even creating entirely new constructs when necessary. But they had also lost much. for the greatest works of wraithbone crafting from before the fall had been created using techniques and knowledge that died with their makers. The surviving bone singers could maintain and repair the craft worlds, could grow new spirit stones and create wraithbone constructs for war, but they could not replicate the most advanced creations of their ancestors. This represented a broader pattern in Eldari civilization. They were, in many ways, a race living among ruins, surrounded by the achievements of their ancestors, but unable to fully recreate or match them. Each generation preserved what it could and passed that knowledge to the next, but there was an inevitable degradation over time, a slow loss of capability and understanding that no amount of care could completely prevent. The Eldari were aware of this decline, could see it happening, but they lacked the resources and population to reverse it. They could only slow the decay and hope that somehow, someday, circumstances would change enough to allow for genuine renewal. The Drukhari of Commorragh had developed their own perverse culture around the necessity of causing suffering to sustain themselves. The hierarchies of Dark Eldar society were based not on wealth or military power alone, but on one's ability to harvest suffering and delay Slaanesh's claim. Those who were most skilled at inflicting pain and extracting psychic sustenance from their victims rose to positions of power and influence. The homunculi, the master torturers and flesh crafters who had learned to extend life indefinitely through their grotesque arts, occupied a special place in this hierarchy. Their services sought by even the most powerful archons. The arenas of Commorragh, where wiches performed elaborate gladiatorial combats for the entertainment of crowds and the sustenance provided by their victims' deaths, represented one of the city's primary industries. These combats were not simple fights to the death, but carefully choreographed performances that maximized the entertainment value and the psychic harvest. A skilled witch could make a single victim's death last for hours, extracting every possible moment of suffering while also demonstrating athletic prowess and aesthetic grace. The greatest witch cults commanded enormous respect and resources, their performances attended by the highest ranks of Dark Eldar society. Yet even in Dark Commorragh, there were gradations of depravity and occasional glimpses of something that might have been termed honor in a different context. The cabals operated according to strict hierarchies and codes of conduct, even if those codes involved treachery and assassination as acceptable tools of advancement. Individual Drukhari could form genuine partnerships and even friendships, relationships based on mutual benefit and trust that endured across centuries. And some Drukhari, a very few, retained enough memory of what their people had been before the fall to feel something like regret for what they had become, though they would never admit such weakness openly. The relationship between the Drukhari and the Craftworld Eldari remained complicated by more than just moral disagreements. They were, after all, the same species, divided by philosophy and circumstance rather than biology. Occasionally, individuals crossed from one society to the other. Craftworld Eldari who lost their spirit stones might flee to Commorragh, accepting the Dark City's brutal ethos as the only alternative to Slaanesh's immediate claim. Drukhari who, tired of their existence of sustained cruelty, might seek refuge on Craftworlds, though they were rarely welcomed and often viewed with deep suspicion. These crossings were infrequent but not unknown, representing the porous boundary between the two cultures despite their profound differences. The prophecy of Yinad's eventual birth and confrontation with Slaanesh offered hope to many Eldari, but it was hope tinged with despair. For the birth to occur naturally, through the gradual accumulation of Eldari souls in infinity circuits across millennia, would require generations more of decline and struggle. Many questioned whether the species would survive long enough for Yinad to accumulate sufficient power to challenge Slaanesh. The alternative, attempting to force Yinad's premature birth through ritual and sacrifice, carried enormous risks. What if the god was born too weak to truly threaten the Dark Prince? What if the rituals themselves backfired, feeding Slaanesh rather than empowering Yinad? These were questions without clear answers, yet decisions would need to be made regardless. The Eldari understanding of chaos had evolved significantly since the fall. Where before they had viewed the warp as simply a part of nature, a realm to be navigated and used like any other resource, they now understood its fundamental hostility to ordered existence. The Chaos Gods were not merely powerful entities dwelling in the Immaterium. They were existential threats to reality itself, forces of entropy and corruption that sought to unmake everything the Eldari valued. Slaanesh was the most personal of these threats, but the Eldari recognized that all four ruinous powers ultimately endangered not just their species, but all life and all possibility of meaning or value in the universe. This understanding sometimes placed the Eldari in the strange position of defending or aiding other species against chaos corruption. Not out of altruism, but from cold calculation that any victory for chaos weakened the forces of order that kept reality coherent. When Eldari intervened to prevent human worlds from falling to chaos, or when they shared intelligence about chaos movements with imperial authorities, they did so not out of friendship, but from recognition that humanity's wars against chaos served Eldari interests as well. The enemy of one's enemy was not necessarily a friend, but might at least be a temporary ally against greater threats. The sacred places of the Eldari, the shrines and temples dedicated to their lost gods, remained points of power and importance despite the deity's destruction. These locations, scattered across craft worlds and hidden in webway passages, still resonated with psychic energy associated with the gods who had once been worshipped there. Eldari who visited these shrines reported feeling closer to their heritage, experiencing fleeting impressions of the gods as they had been before Slaanesh consumed them. Whether these impressions were genuine spiritual experiences or simply psychological responses to culturally significant locations remained debated. But the shrine's importance to Eldari faith and identity was undeniable. The Shrine of Kine, present on every craft world that hosted a fragment of the shattered war god, served as the focal point for the Avatar's awakening in times of war. The ritual of awakening the Avatar required sacrifice, traditionally an exarch offering themselves to merge temporarily with Kine's essence, allowing the god fragment to manifest in physical form. This sacrifice was considered the highest honor an exarch could achieve, though it often resulted in their permanent merging with the Avatar or their death once the battle was concluded. The awakened Avatar became a towering figure of molten iron and rage, capable of facing enemy heroes and monsters in single combat, while inspiring nearby Eldari warriors to heights of martial prowess they could not reach on their own. The economic and resource management challenges facing the craft worlds would have overwhelmed any society with less discipline and foresight than the Eldari possessed. Each craft world was effectively a closed system, unable to reliably trade with other craft worlds or with external civilizations. Every resource had to be carefully husbanded, recycled, and conserved. Population had to be managed with precision, balancing the need for more Eldari to defend the craft world and perform necessary functions against the limitations of available resources. This constant balancing act required sacrifice and compromise from everyone, acceptance of rationing and restrictions that would have been unthinkable in the days of Empire. The birth rate among Craftworld Eldari remained deliberately controlled, lower than their long lifespans and low mortality rates would naturally produce. Each birth was celebrated as a precious addition to the Craftworld's population, each child valued not just by their family, but by the entire community as representing hope for the future. But the Eldari could not simply reproduce without limit, for their wraithbone habitats had finite capacity, and their self-sustaining systems could only support populations up to certain thresholds.
Growth had to be carefully managed, balanced against losses, and against the slow degradation of the Craftworld's infrastructure that could not be entirely prevented despite the Bonesinger's best efforts. The training and education of young Eldari took on special importance in this context. Each individual needed to be capable of contributing to their Craftworld survival in multiple ways, able to function in different roles as circumstances required.
The path system structured this education, guiding young Eldari through various disciplines and experiences that would give them the breadth of knowledge and skill necessary to be valuable members of their society. A young Eldari might walk the path of the student, learning history and science, before transitioning to the path of the artisan to master a craft, then perhaps trying the path of the warrior to learn combat skills, accumulating capabilities across decades of structured development. The psychological toll of living under constant threat, aware that death meant not rest but eternal torment, affected every Eldari regardless of how well they maintained their disciplines. Depression, anxiety, and other mental health challenges were common, addressed through counseling, meditation, and the support of community, but never entirely overcome. Some Eldari found solace in their work, throwing themselves into their chosen path with enough intensity to leave no room for existential dread. Others turned to philosophy or spirituality, seeking meaning in service to their craft world or in the hope of Yanad's eventual triumph. And some, tragically, could not cope and chose to end their lives prematurely, accepting Slaanesh claim rather than continuing to struggle against inevitable doom. Suicide was not common among the Eldari, for their survival instinct remained strong, and the horror of what awaited them beyond death deterred most from taking that final step. But it occurred with sufficient frequency that Craftworld societies had developed rituals and protocols around it, ways of acknowledging the choice while mourning the loss it represented. A spirit stone recovered from one who had chosen death would be treated no differently than one recovered from an Eldari who died in battle or from natural causes, for the dead deserved honor regardless of how they had died. The living, meanwhile, would gather to remember the deceased and to strengthen their own resolve to continue the struggle a little longer. The Eldari understanding that their civilization was in terminal decline, that barring some radical change in circumstances, their species was doomed to eventual extinction, colored every aspect of their society and culture. They were a people without a future in any conventional sense, unable to hope for growth or renewal, fighting only to delay the inevitable for as long as possible. This knowledge could have led to nihilism and despair, to the conclusion that nothing mattered if the end was certain. But instead, most Eldari found meaning in the struggle itself, in the determination to face their doom with dignity and courage, in the effort to preserve their culture and values for as long as they existed to appreciate them. The legacy of the fall extended beyond just the Eldari themselves to affect the entire galaxy. The Eye of Terror served as a permanent staging ground for chaos forces, a realm where demon armies could gather and from which warbands could launch their attacks on the material universe. The warp storms that had erupted during Slaanesh's birth had permanently destabilized regions of space, making travel difficult or impossible across vast areas. The knowledge that a species could create a chaos god through their collective actions hung over all civilizations like a sword, a warning that corruption and excess could have consequences beyond anything imaginable. Humanity, in particular, had learned to fear the Eldari's example. The Imperium's rigid control over its citizens, its brutal suppression of pleasure cults and deviant behavior, its Puritan ideology that prized duty and sacrifice over personal fulfillment, all of these arose partly from the example of what had happened to the Eldari. The ecclesiarchy preached that the emperor protected humanity from the fate that had befallen the Eldar. That faith and adherence to doctrine prevented humans from falling into the same traps. Whether this was true or simply convenient propaganda, it shaped imperial policy and culture in profound ways. The ultimate question facing the Eldar as they looked toward a future that might not exist was whether their species deserved to survive. They had, after all, created the catastrophe that doomed them through their own choices and actions. The pleasure cults had not been forced upon them by external enemies. The descent into depravity had been a conscious decision, repeated by billions of individuals who chose sensation over wisdom. Could a species that had made such choices claim any right to continue existing? Or had they earned their doom through their own failings? Different Eldar answered these questions in different ways. Some accepted their guilt and saw their current struggle as penance, an attempt to atone for their ancestors' crimes by living disciplined lives and fighting against chaos. Others rejected the premise entirely, arguing that the current generation bore no responsibility for choices made thousands of years before they were born, and that they had every right to fight for survival. And some occupied a middle ground, acknowledging the reality of collective guilt while insisting that this guilt did not negate their right to exist or their duty to preserve what remained of their civilization. The fall of the Eldar stands as the most complete and terrible catastrophe in galactic history, a cataclysm that destroyed an empire that had endured for millions of years and killed trillions in a single psychic scream. It created a god of terrible power and evil, tore a permanent wound in reality itself, and condemned an entire species to eternal torment. Yet through all this horror, some Eldar survived. They adapted, they endured, they found ways to continue existing despite facing doom with every breath. Their story is one of loss beyond measure, but also of resilience and determination, of a people who refused to simply lie down and die even when extinction seemed inevitable. 10,000 years after the fall, the Eldar persist. Fewer in number than they once were, diminished in power and possibility, haunted by their past and facing a future that grows darker with each passing century. But they persist. They walk their paths on distant craft worlds. They raid from dark Commorragh. They tend their maiden worlds as Exodites. They dance in the laughing god's shadow as harlequins.
In all these forms, through all these choices, they continue. And in their continuation, in their refusal to accept the doom that awaits them, they write new chapters in a story that was supposed to have ended with Slaanesh's birth. The legacy of the fall will never fade, cannot be forgotten or overcome. It has defined what the Eldari are and what they can become. But it need not be the final chapter in their story. As long as a single Eldari draws breath, as long as one spirit stone preserves a soul from she who thirsts, as long as hope for Yinit's triumph remains, however faint, the story continues. The fall was their greatest tragedy, but perhaps not their ending. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, even the faintest hope can be worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth enduring any hardship to preserve. This is what the Eldari have learned, what they teach through their continued existence. That even after losing everything, even facing certain doom, life finds a way to persist. And in that persistence, in that stubborn refusal to surrender to darkness, lies something that might be called heroic.